Can the DJI Mavic 2 Pro film in 4K 60 frames per second? Well, so the DJI Mavic 2 Pro can film in 4K in two modes, FOV and HQ. And if you haven't seen my video on that yet, I'll link it in the description below. The reality of the Mavic 2 Pro filming in 4K FOV isn't exactly true. According to DJI, on their 5.5K sensor, they record every second pixel in FOV mode, essentially giving you a 2.7K image, upscaling it to a 4K resolution or clip, if you want to call it that. So when you actually look at this clip and the stats of it, it's going to show you a 4K resolution. However, it's just because it's been saved to that resolution. Very similar to if you put an HD clip on a 4K timeline and you had to export it. Although DJI claims there's some magic behind it, according to my previous video that I mentioned, you can see it's not exactly. So if the Mavic 2 Pro can film in 2.7K 60 frames per second FOV, and 4K FOV is actually 2.7K upscaled, what if there wasn't a difference in 2.7K FOV to 4K FOV? Wouldn't that make it film 4K 60 frames per second? I've got some test footage. Check this out. First things first, if you can select 4K to watch this, I do suggest you do, because then you're going to probably see the best difference that I'm seeing. Here we go. So this first clip is 4K 30 frames per second at FOV mode. This is 2.7K 30 frames per second FOV mode. And this is 2.7K 60 frames per second, and clearly FOV mode as well. Now, all of these were filmed in HLG, and the exact same highlights were pulled down. So there's no LUT or anything added on this. It's pretty much kind of HLG, and if you don't know, if you've never worked with HLG, you just kind of pull down the highlights and fix your shadows, and that's pretty much it to make it look normal. But it's quite funny that 2.7K allows full customization of HLG and log as well, including 4K 30 frames per second FOV. Now I'm going to crop in so we can see the difference. So this is 4K 30 frames per second cropped in at just over 600%. 2.7K 30 frames per second. And 2.7K 60 frames per second. Now I'm going to do a side-by-side on all three of those as well as show you another scene. But if you're wondering why I've used 30 frames per second, a lot of cameras tend to be a little bit clearer using 30 frames as opposed to 60 frames. So here's a side-by-side comparison. So on the left you have the 4K 30 frames, 2.7 in the middle, and 2.7K 60 frames. And here's a freeze frame for you. Now what I want you to look at, I know some places may look clearer than others, but have a look at the bricks on the first building that you see. Whether it's 4K or 2.7K, you cannot tell a difference. So here's another cropping at 4K 30 frames, 2.7 30, and 2.7K 60. At any point you can pause this and have a look at the details if you like. Now the details differ from shot to shot and scene to scene, which is a little bit odd. And the 2.7K 60 frames sometimes looks a little bit softer and the 4K a bit sharper in certain aspects. And in the previous clip that you saw on the bricks, they were equally sharp. So is DJI lying to us? So if the Mavic 2 Pro is filming 2.7K 60 frames per second, why didn't DJI just upscale it to us in 4K like they did with 4K 30 frames? There's three possible reasons. The Mavic 3 Pro, which seems to be put on hold. The redundancy of the Phantom 4 Pro. Now I know a lot of people are going to say, but hold on, the Phantom 4 Pro is amazing. I do agree. But a lot of people move to the Phantom 4 Pro due to 60 frames per second, even considering the size of it. Finally, the processor that's in the Mavic 2 Pro may not be able to upscale the 2.7K 60 frames per second to 4K when saving it onto the SD card without some lag causing issues or whatever it may be. So that's the difference between the two. It's so minimal in certain scenes that I've filmed on, I actually thought the 2.7K 60 frames was even clearer than the 4K 30 frames. in FOV. I think a lot of it has to do with highlights, how the sensor's reading the 2.7K or the other one and not all the pixels, or whatever it's doing. Let me know in the comments below if you think this thing could film 4K 60 frames per second, or if this is a good rendition of 4K 60 frames per second. Now if you're going to head down there and say, hang on, you clickbaited me with Mavic 2 Pro 4K 60 frames per second. Now if you're going to say that, how come you're not saying anything about DJI's Mavic 2 Pro filming 4K 30 frames per second full field of view? You see what I mean? So thanks for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and yeah, if you do need 60 frames per second out of your Mavic 2 Pro, whether you're filming mountain bikers bombing down a hill or car shots and you need a little bit of slow-mo on a timeline, don't be shy to set it to 2.7K 60 frames per second and throw it on a 4K timeline. You're not going to see a difference. So wherever you are in the world, have a good day, good evening, good night. Goodbye.